A widow dies, leaving only shame behind. A baby cries alone in God's house, while a town turns its back. But when the man everyone calls devil steps through those church doors, everything changes. Because sometimes salvation comes from the last place you'd ever look. The baby's cry pierced through Reverend McKinney's morning prayers like a knife through silk. He'd been kneeling at the altar for 20 minutes, trying to find words that might wash away the taste of yesterday's funeral, when that sound, raw, desperate, hungry, shattered his concentration completely. Sarah Whitmore was 3 days in the ground, and her child was 3 days into learning that the world was a cold, unforgiving place that had no room for bastards and their dead mothers. McKinney rose slowly, his knees protesting against the hard wooden floor, and turned toward the small bundle lying in the front pew. The infant's face was red and twisted with rage or hunger or both, tiny fists beating the air like he was fighting invisible demons. Someone had wrapped him in Sarah's old shawl, the blue one she'd worn to church every Sunday before her belly started showing, and the whispers started following. Now that same shawl was all that stood between the child and a world that had already decided he didn't belong anywhere. The Reverend approached cautiously, as if the baby might explode if handled too roughly. 3 days of this. 3 days of that crying echoing through the church, while the good people of Cedar Falls walked past with their noses in the air, and their consciences tucked safely away where they couldn't hear the sound of innocence being abandoned. McKinney had tried feeding the child with a wet cloth dipped in milk, but his hands shook too much, and the baby was getting weaker by the hour. "Somebody's got to take him," McKinney whispered to the empty church, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were lies. Nobody was coming. The Whitmore family had disowned Sarah the moment they'd learned about her condition, and they'd made it crystal clear that her bastard child would find no welcome at their door. The other families in town had their own children to worry about, and times were hard enough without taking on the burden of raising a child born in sin. The church door creaked open just as the baby's crying reached a fever pitch that seemed to shake the very rafters. McKinney's heart jumped with hope. Maybe someone had finally come to their senses. Maybe someone had remembered what Christian charity actually meant. But when he turned, his hope curdled into something cold and bitter. Ezra Cole stood in the doorway like a shadow made flesh, his long black coat hanging loose around his tall frame, hat pulled low over eyes that most folks in Cedar Falls swore belonged to the devil himself. He didn't remove his hat, didn't offer any greeting, didn't even acknowledge McKinney's presence. He just stood there listening to the baby cry, his weathered face unreadable as carved stone. "Mr. Cole," McKinney stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "I didn't expect. That is, we don't usually." The Reverend's words died in his throat. What could he say? That Ezra Cole wasn't welcome in God's house. That a man who'd spent the last 5 years living alone in the hills, trading with the Apache and drinking away whatever demons haunted him, had no business standing on holy ground. Ezra moved forward without invitation, his boots echoing against the wooden floor with each measured step. The baby's crying seemed to grow quieter as he approached, as if even an infant could sense the presence of something different, something dangerous. McKinney backed away instinctively, clutching his prayer book to his chest like a shield. "How long?" Ezra's voice was rough as sandpaper, unused to conversation after years of speaking mainly to his horse and the occasional Apache trader who didn't flinch at his reputation. 3 days, McKinney whispered. "Since the funeral, nobody wants." He gestured helplessly at the bundle in the pew. Ezra reached the front pew and looked down at the crying child. The baby's face was blotched and swollen from 3 days of tears, his tiny body trembling with exhaustion and hunger. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Ezra did something that made McKinney's heart stop completely. He reached down and lifted the baby into his arms. The change was instantaneous. The crying stopped as if someone had thrown a switch, replaced by a silence so profound that McKinney could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Ezra held the child awkwardly at first, like a man handling dynamite, But then something shifted. His arms adjusted, his stance softened, and suddenly the most feared man in 3 counties was cradling a baby like he'd been born to it. "What's his name?" Ezra asked, not taking his eyes off the infant. Sarah never." McKinney struggled to find his voice. "She died before she could say. The fever took her too quick." Ezra nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. The baby had stopped crying completely now, tiny fingers grasping at the rough fabric of Ezra's coat. For a moment, something flickered across the outcast's face. Pain, maybe, or recognition, or something else entirely that McKinney couldn't name. "Then he needs one," Ezra said simply. Before McKinney could respond, the church door burst open again, and this time it was Martha Whitmore who came sweeping in like an avenging angel, her black mourning dress rustling with righteous indignation. Her eyes found Ezra immediately, and her face went white as church linen. "Get away from that child," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Ezra. How dare you defile this sacred space with your presence?" Ezra didn't move, didn't even look at her. He kept his attention focused on the baby, who was now making soft, cooing sounds and trying to focus his unfocused eyes on the stranger's face. "Mrs. Whitmore," McKinney began, but she cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Don't you Mrs. Whitmore me, Harold McKinney. I want to know why that creature is in my family's church holding my granddaughter's bastard. He's not your grandson when it suits you, but he's your responsibility when it doesn't," Ezra said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the church despite its low volume. "Interesting how that works." Martha's face turned purple. "How dare you speak to me? Everyone knows what you are, what you've done. Murderer, savage. You think I'd let you near an innocent child?" The baby made a soft sound, not crying, just a gentle gurgle, and Ezra's thumb brushed across the tiny forehead with surprising gentleness. "Innocent," he repeated, the word carrying weight that seemed to settle over the church like dust. "That's more than most folks in this town can claim." "Reverend McKinney," Martha wheeled on the preacher, her eyes blazing, "I demand that you remove this man from church property immediately. The very idea that that anyone would allow." She gestured frantically at Ezra, words failing her. McKinney looked between Martha and Ezra, his hands twisting the prayer book until the binding creaked. 3 days. 3 days of that baby crying while Martha Whitmore and every other soul in Cedar Falls had walked past those church doors without stopping. 3 days of watching an innocent child waste away because the sins of the mother had somehow transferred to her son in their minds. "Mrs. Whitmore," McKinney said carefully, "perhaps we should focus on what's best for the child. What's best for the child is that he be removed from the presence of that devil." Martha pointed at Ezra again, her finger shaking with rage. "Everyone knows what happened up at Broken Creek. Everyone knows about the massacre, about what he did to those settlers." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Ezra's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he didn't respond. Didn't deny it, didn't confirm it, didn't even acknowledge that she'd spoken. He just stood there holding Sarah Whitmore's son while the accusations swirled around him like autumn leaves in a windstorm. "I know what I know," Martha continued, her voice rising to fill the church. "And I know that no child of Christian blood should be in the hands of a man like that. Reverend, if you don't act, I'll have Sheriff Morrison down here within the hour." McKinney felt sweat beading on his forehead. Sheriff Morrison would come if Martha called. She had that kind of influence in Cedar Falls. And then what? Would they tear the baby away from the first person who'd managed to quiet his cries? Would they drag Ezra out of the church by force while the infant screamed himself sick again? "The child needs care," Ezra said, his voice cutting through Martha's tirade like a blade. "Food, warmth, someone to tend him, you offering." Martha's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. That's not the circumstances of his birth." "Don't make him less hungry," Ezra finished. "Don't make him need less love." The word love seemed to echo in the church longer than it should have, bouncing off the rafters and settling into the pews like morning dew. McKinney stared at Ezra Cole, the man half the territory called a cold-blooded killer, the man who'd lived alone in the wilderness for 5 years, the man who supposedly had ice water in his veins and death in his eyes, and saw something he'd never expected to see: tenderness. Martha Whitmore stormed out of the church like a woman possessed, her skirts whipping behind her as she marched straight toward the sheriff's office. McKinney watched her go through the dusty window, his stomach churning with the knowledge that whatever fragile peace had settled over the church was about to be shattered completely. Ezra seemed unbothered by the threat, his attention still focused entirely on the baby who had fallen asleep in his arms, tiny chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of trust. "She'll be back," McKinney warned, wrapping his arms around himself as if he could ward off the coming storm. "With half the town, most likely." Ezra shifted the baby slightly, supporting the small head with one large, calloused hand. "Let them come." The simplicity of those 3 words sent a chill down McKinney's spine. He'd heard enough stories about Ezra Cole to know that the man didn't make idle threats or empty promises. When Ezra said, "Let them come," he meant it with the kind of certainty that came from a man who'd already faced down worse things than an angry mob of townsfolk. "Mr. Cole," McKinney began hesitantly, "perhaps you don't understand the position this puts me in. The church council, the congregation, they won't stand for this. They'll demand answers." "Then give them some." Ezra finally looked up from the sleeping infant, his dark eyes meeting McKinney's with an intensity that made the Reverend take a step backward. "Tell them their Christian charity extends about as far as their comfort zone. Tell them they'd rather let a baby starve than soil their precious reputations." McKinney flinched as if he'd been slapped. "That's not. They're good people, Mr. Cole, concerned about what people might think if they're seen helping the wrong kind of child." Ezra's voice carried no anger, just a bone-deep weariness that spoke of too many years watching good people make bad choices for comfortable reasons. "I've seen their kind of good before, Reverend. Seen what it looks like when it's tested." The baby stirred in Ezra's arms, making a soft mewling sound that seemed impossibly small in the large church. Without thinking, Ezra began a gentle rocking motion, his whole body swaying slightly as if he'd done this 1,000 times before. The movement was so natural, so instinctive, that McKinney found himself staring in bewilderment. "You've done this before," McKinney said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Ezra's rocking faltered for just a moment, so briefly that someone else might have missed it entirely. But McKinney caught the hesitation, the flash of something raw and painful that crossed the man's weathered features before the mask slipped back into place. "Long time ago," Ezra said finally, his voice rougher than before. Before McKinney could press further, the church door slammed open with such force that it cracked against the wall. Sheriff Morrison strode in with Martha Whitmore right behind him, followed by what looked like half the town council and a handful of other concerned citizens who'd apparently decided that their Sunday afternoon would be better spent confronting the local pariah than tending to their own business. Sheriff Morrison was a big man with a big mustache and an even bigger opinion of himself, the kind of lawman who'd rather talk his way out of trouble than shoot his way through it. He'd been elected on a platform of keeping the peace, which mostly meant keeping people like Ezra Cole from upsetting the delicate social balance that kept Cedar Falls running smoothly. "Ezra," Morrison said, his hand resting on his gun belt but not quite touching his weapon, "heard you're causing some trouble down here." "Heard wrong," Ezra replied without looking up from the baby. "Just tending to some business that everybody else seems to have forgotten about." Martha stepped forward, her face still flushed with righteous anger. "Sheriff Morrison, I demand that you arrest this man for disturbing the peace. He has no right to be in this church, no right to touch that child." "Now, Mrs. Whitmore," Morrison said carefully, "I can't arrest a man for holding a baby in a church. That's not exactly against the law. But his very presence here is an affront to God. Martha's voice rose to a near shriek. Everyone knows what he is, what he's done. Would you let a wolf tend sheep? The baby woke at the sound of raised voices, his face scrunching up in preparation for another crying fit. But before the first wail could escape, Ezra's thumb brushed gently across the tiny forehead, and the infant settled again, dark eyes trying to focus on the rough face above him. "Seems to me the baby doesn't mind," observed Council Member Harrison, a dry goods merchant with more sense than most of his peers. "Been crying for 3 days straight until now." "That's beside the point," Martha snapped. "The point is that this man has no business." "The point," Ezra interrupted quietly, "is that this child needs care, food, someone to look after him, you volunteering, Mrs. Whitmore." Martha's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before she found her voice again. The circumstances, it wouldn't be proper." "Proper?" Ezra repeated the word like he was tasting something bitter. Funny how proper changes depending on who's doing the asking. Sheriff Morrison stepped closer, his boots echoing hollowly against the wooden floor. "Look, Ezra, nobody's questioning your intentions here, but you got to understand how this looks. A man with your reputation alone with a helpless baby, it makes people nervous." "My reputation." Ezra's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly through the church. "And what exactly does my reputation say about me, Sheriff?" Morrison shifted uncomfortably, aware that he was walking into dangerous territory. "Well, there's the matter of Broken Creek." The words hit the church like a thunderclap. Suddenly the air itself seemed thicker, harder to breathe. Even the baby seemed to sense the change, his tiny hands gripping more tightly at Ezra's coat. "Go on," Ezra said, his voice deadly calm. "Tell them about Broken Creek, Sheriff. Tell them what my reputation says I did." Morrison's hand moved closer to his gun, though whether from instinct or genuine fear was hard to say. They say you killed them settlers, the whole family, man, woman, and—" He stopped, his words dying in his throat as the full implication hit him. Man, woman, and children. Ezra Cole was accused of murdering children, and here he stood holding an infant with more gentleness than any of them had shown in 3 days. "And children," Ezra finished for him. "That's what they say, isn't it, that I murdered children?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even Martha seemed to have lost her voice, her face pale as she stared at the man holding her granddaughter's bastard child with such obvious care. "So tell me, Sheriff," Ezra continued, his voice still deadly quiet, "if I'm the kind of man who kills children, why would I be here? Why would I be holding this baby like he matters? Why would I care whether he lives or dies?" Morrison opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The logic was inescapable, and everyone in the church could see it. A man who murdered children wouldn't cradle an infant with such tenderness. A man who killed families wouldn't risk his own safety to save an abandoned baby. "Unless," Ezra said, his eyes meeting Morrison's directly, "unless the stories you've been telling about me aren't quite the whole truth." The baby chose that moment to make a small, hungry sound, not crying, just the soft mewling of an infant who needed feeding. Ezra looked down at the child, and for just a moment his hard mask slipped completely. The expression that crossed his face was pure anguish, the look of a man remembering something too painful to bear. "He's hungry," Ezra said simply. "Been crying for 3 days because he's hungry and nobody cared enough to do anything about it." "Mr. Cole," McKinney said hesitantly, "if you're suggesting that the people of Cedar Falls don't care about children—" "I'm not suggesting anything, Reverend." Ezra's voice was flat, empty of emotion. "I'm stating facts. This baby has been crying in your church for 3 days, 3 days, and not one person in this room lifted a finger to help him until I walked through that door." The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Around the church, People shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Ezra's eyes. They'd all heard the crying. They'd all walked past. They'd all found reasons why it wasn't their responsibility, why someone else should handle it, why the circumstances made it too complicated for them to get involved. Now, Ezra continued, his voice taking on an edge that made everyone in the church take notice, I'm going to ask you all a simple question. Are you here because you care about this child's welfare? Or are you here because you don't like seeing someone like me showing you what real charity looks like? Martha found her voice again, though it came out as more of a croak. You can't. Someone like you can't care for a child. What do you know about raising a baby? Something flickered in Ezra's eyes, pain, memory, loss, before the mask settled back into place. More than you might think, Mrs. Whitmore. More than I wish I did. The baby made another soft sound, and Ezra's attention immediately focused back on the infant. With one hand, he began searching through his coat pockets until he found what he was looking for, a small piece of cloth that he dipped in the font of holy water near the altar. What are you doing? McKinney asked, alarmed. What needs doing? Ezra replied, gently placing the damp cloth against the baby's lips. The infant latched onto it immediately, sucking desperately at the moisture. He needs milk, but water's better than nothing. Sheriff Morrison watched this display with growing confusion. Ezra, you can't just take someone's child. Whose child? Ezra's question cut through the sheriff's protest like a blade. Who exactly am I taking him from? His mother's dead. His family disowned him. The good people of Cedar Falls have decided he's not their problem. He looked around the church, his gaze settling on each face in turn. So whose child is he, Sheriff? Who's going to stop me from taking him? The question hung unanswered in the air, because the truth was, nobody wanted the baby badly enough to fight for him. They wanted him gone, wanted the problem to disappear, but they didn't want him enough to actually take responsibility for his welfare. This is insane, Martha whispered, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. A man like you, what kind of life could you possibly give him? Ezra looked down at the sleeping infant, his expression unreadable. The kind where he doesn't cry alone in a church for 3 days while good Christian folk walk past and pretend they don't hear him. The baby's tiny hand had worked its way out of the shawl and was now gripping Ezra's finger with surprising strength. The sight of those small fingers wrapped around the scarred, calloused digit seemed to break something loose in the church's atmosphere. I'll take him, Ezra said quietly, his words carrying the weight of absolute decision. I'll care for him, feed him, give him a name and a place to grow up, and if any of you have a problem with that, he looked up, his dark eyes sweeping across the assembled crowd. You had 3 days to offer an alternative, 3 days to step up and show what Christian charity actually looks like. You chose not to. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward again, his hand now openly resting on his gun. Ezra, I can't let you just walk out of here with that baby. There are procedures, laws. Laws? Ezra's laugh was bitter as winter wind. What law says a baby should starve while good people debate his legitimacy? What procedure covers abandoning a child because his mother made mistakes? The child welfare laws don't apply to bastards born to dead whores, Ezra cut him off harshly. At least not in Cedar Falls, at least not when it's inconvenient. The crude words made several people in the church gasp, but Ezra didn't seem to care about their delicate sensibilities anymore. You want to arrest me, Sheriff? Go ahead, but you'll have to explain to a judge why you let a baby cry for 3 days before deciding the law mattered. You'll have to explain why the good people of Cedar Falls couldn't find room in their hearts for one small child. Morrison's hand fell away from his gun. He looked around the church at the assembled citizens, seeing the shame and discomfort written across their faces. Ezra was right, and everyone knew it. They'd all failed this child, and now they were angry at the one man who'd stepped up to help him. This isn't over, Martha said, her voice shaking with rage and something that might have been fear. I won't let you. I won't allow." "You won't allow what, Mrs. Whitmore?" Ezra's voice was deadly quiet again. "Me to care for a child nobody else wanted. Me to give him food and shelter and a chance at life. Exactly what is it you won't allow?" Martha's mouth opened and closed several times before she turned and fled the church, her footsteps echoing off the walls like gunshots. One by one, the other citizens followed her out, leaving only Sheriff Morrison, Reverend McKinney, and Ezra with the baby. "You're making a mistake, Ezra," Morrison said finally. "This town won't forget this. They won't forgive it." Ezra looked down at the sleeping infant, his expression softening again. "Good. Maybe that means they'll remember what it cost them to learn what charity really looks like." The ride to Ezra's cabin took 2 hours through terrain that would have challenged most riders, but his horse knew the way even in the growing darkness. The baby had remained quiet throughout the journey, wrapped securely in Sarah's shawl and cradled against Ezra's chest. Every few minutes, Ezra would look down to check on the infant, his weathered face creased with worry that seemed foreign on features more accustomed to stone-cold indifference. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pines, their branches swaying in the evening breeze like dark fingers against the star-filled sky. It was a simple structure, one room with a stone fireplace, a few pieces of handmade furniture, and shelves lined with books that would have surprised anyone who believed the stories about Ezra Cole being nothing more than a savage killer. The place was clean but sparse, the home of a man who'd learned to live with only what he absolutely needed. Ezra dismounted carefully, one arm still supporting the sleeping baby while he tied his horse to the hitching post. The infant stirred at the movement but didn't wake, his tiny face peaceful in a way that made something twist painfully in Ezra's chest. How long had it been since he'd held a child like this? How many years since he'd felt the weight of complete trust in his arms? Inside the cabin, Ezra lit a lamp with one hand while keeping the baby secure with the other. The warm light flickered across the walls, revealing details that spoke of a man more complex than his reputation suggested. A violin case sat on a shelf next to medical books. A half-finished carving of a horse lay on the table beside a worn Bible. This wasn't the den of a heartless killer. This was the refuge of a man trying to outrun his past. The baby made a soft sound, and Ezra's attention snapped back to the immediate problem. The child needed feeding, and Ezra had no idea how to manage that particular challenge. He'd given the infant water at the church, but that was hardly a solution. Babies needed milk, and Ezra was fresh out of mother's. He settled into the rocking chair near the fireplace, the baby still cradled in his arms, and tried to think. The nearest neighbor with a cow was Mrs. Patterson, but she lived 3 miles away and would probably slam her door in his face the moment she saw him coming. The general store in town might have tinned milk, but returning to Cedar Falls so soon after the confrontation at the church would be asking for trouble. The baby's eyes opened, unfocused but aware, and fixed on Ezra's face with the kind of intensity that only infants possessed. For a moment, neither moved. Then the tiny mouth opened, and instead of crying, the baby made a soft cooing sound that seemed to echo through the cabin like music. "Well," Ezra said quietly, his voice rough with emotion he didn't want to acknowledge, "I guess it's just you and me now, little one." The words triggered a memory so sharp and sudden that Ezra nearly gasped aloud. Another baby, another time, another voice saying almost the same words. But that had been different. That had been his own child, his own wife, his own life before everything went to hell and took his soul along for the ride. Ezra closed his eyes and tried to push the memory away, but it clung to him like smoke, filling his mind with images he'd spent 5 years trying to forget. Mary's laugh, little Thomas's first steps, the way their cabin had felt like home instead of just a place to hide from the world. All of it gone now, reduced to graves on a hillside and a reputation that followed him like a curse. The baby made another sound, bringing Ezra back to the present with a jolt. The infant was watching him with those dark, serious eyes, as if he could sense the pain radiating from the man holding him. Ezra found himself speaking before he'd consciously decided to do so. "Your mama was a good woman," he said softly. "I didn't know her well, but I could see it in her eyes. She had the look of someone who cared too much in a world that didn't care enough." He paused, studying the tiny face. "She named you in her heart, I think, even if she never got the chance to say it out loud." The baby's hand worked free of the shawl again, tiny fingers grasping at the air until they found Ezra's thumb. The grip was surprisingly strong, and Ezra found himself smiling for the first time in longer than he could remember. "You need a name," he continued, his voice taking on a gentler tone. "Can't just keep calling you baby forever. Your grandmother would probably prefer something biblical, something respectable." He snorted softly. "But I don't think your grandmother gets a vote anymore." Outside, an owl called from the darkness, its voice lonely and wild. The sound made Ezra think of all the nights he'd sat in this same chair, staring into the fire and wondering if he'd ever feel human again. Now, with this unexpected burden in his arms, he felt something stirring that he'd thought was dead and buried. "Thomas," he said suddenly, the name slipping out before he could stop it. That was my boy's name before." He looked down at the infant, who seemed to be listening intently despite his obvious youth. "But maybe that's not right for you. Maybe you need something of your own." The baby made a soft sound that might have been agreement or might have been hunger. Ezra decided to interpret it as the latter and rose from the chair, still cradling the infant carefully. He moved to the small pantry area of the cabin and began searching through his limited supplies, looking for anything that might serve as makeshift baby food. He found a small amount of sugar, some flour, and a jar of honey that Mrs. Patterson had traded him for a repaired wagon wheel. Not ideal, but it might be enough to make a thin gruel that the baby could digest. Ezra had seen Apache women feed infants with similar mixtures when mother's milk wasn't available. As he worked one-handed to prepare the mixture, Ezra found himself talking to the baby again, his voice filling the silence of the cabin in a way it hadn't been filled for years. "I'm not good at this," he admitted, stirring honey into warm water. "Haven't been around babies in a long time, but I figure between the two of us we might manage to keep you alive until you're old enough to take care of yourself." The baby watched him work, dark eyes tracking Ezra's movements with surprising focus. When Ezra dipped a clean cloth into the honey water and offered it to the infant, the tiny mouth latched on immediately, sucking desperately at the makeshift feeding cloth. "That's it," Ezra murmured, relief evident in his voice. "Not exactly mother's milk, but better than nothing." As the baby fed, Ezra found his mind wandering back to the scene at the church. Martha Whitmore's horrified face when she'd seen him holding the child. Sheriff Morrison's uncomfortable questions about Broken Creek. The way the entire town had looked at him like he was some kind of monster for showing basic human decency. They didn't understand, of course. How could they? They saw Ezra Cole, the man who'd allegedly massacred a family at Broken Creek. They saw the killer, the outcast, the savage who lived alone in the wilderness because civilized society couldn't stomach his presence. What they didn't see was the truth, that Ezra Cole had become those things because the world had taken everything good from his life and left him with nothing but rage and regret. The baby finished feeding and seemed content for the moment, his tiny body relaxed in Ezra's arms. Ezra returned to the rocking chair and began the gentle swaying motion that seemed to come naturally, as if his body remembered what his mind tried to forget. "Samuel," he said after a long moment, "that's what I'll call you. Samuel Cooper Cole, the Cooper for your mama because she deserves to be remembered, the Cole because," he paused, considering, "because you're mine now whether the world likes it or not." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending pine needles skittering across the cabin's roof. The sound was familiar and comforting, the voice of the wilderness that had become Ezra's only companion over the past 5 years. But now there was another presence in the cabin, another heartbeat sharing the space he'd thought would always be empty. Samuel made a contented sound and closed his eyes, his breathing settling into the deep rhythm of infant sleep. Ezra continued rocking, afraid to move and disturb this fragile peace. For the first time since Broken Creek, he felt something other than numbness or rage. It wasn't happiness. He wasn't sure he'd ever feel that again, but it was something. Hope, maybe, or purpose. As the night deepened around them, Ezra found himself making plans. Samuel would need proper milk, which meant finding a wet nurse or a reliable source of cow's milk. He'd need clothes designed for infants, not just scraps of shawl. He'd need warmth and safety, and all the things that a child required to grow strong and healthy. But more than that, Samuel would need protection from the people of Cedar Falls who saw his very existence as an affront to their sense of moral order. Martha Whitmore wouldn't give up easily, and neither would the others who believed that Ezra Cole had no right to raise a child. They'd be back, probably with lawyers or judges or whatever authority they could muster to tear Samuel away from the only person who'd shown him genuine care. "Let them come," Ezra whispered, echoing his earlier words to Sheriff Morrison. But now, holding this sleeping child in his arms, the phrase carried a different weight. Now it wasn't just defiance, it was a promise. A vow that he would protect Samuel Cooper Cole with everything he had, regardless of what it cost him. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its lonesome song to the stars. And in the rocking chair by the fireplace, a man who'd been running from his past for 5 years finally stopped long enough to consider what his future might look like. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing about this situation would be simple or safe or comfortable. But as Ezra looked down at Samuel's peaceful face, he realized that easy wasn't what mattered anymore. What mattered was this child, this responsibility, this chance to do something right in a world that had gone so terribly wrong. "I'll keep you safe," Ezra promised, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever it takes, whatever they throw at us, I'll keep you safe." Samuel slept on, unaware that his life had just been claimed by a man the world called a monster, but who might just be the closest thing to a guardian angel that fate was willing to provide. Dawn was still hours away, but Ezra continued rocking, planning, preparing for the battles he knew were coming. Because Martha Whitmore was right about one thing, this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Martha Whitmore didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and a list of names, planning her campaign like a general preparing for war. By sunrise, she'd written 12 letters and composed 3 telegrams, each one carefully worded to paint Ezra Cole as the monster she believed him to be and herself as the righteous grandmother fighting to save an innocent child from the devil's grasp. The first telegram went to Judge Harrison Wells in the territorial capital, a man who owed the Whitmore family several favors from their early support of his political career. The second went to her brother-in-law in Denver, a lawyer with connections to child welfare organizations. The third went to the territorial marshal, requesting an immediate investigation into Ezra Cole's fitness as a guardian. By 9 o'clock that morning, Martha had assembled an impressive coalition in the parlor of her Victorian house on Elm Street. Mayor Hutchins sat beside his wife, both wearing expressions of grave concern. Dr. Pemberton had closed his practice for the morning to attend, bringing with him a leather satchel full of medical journals and legal documents about child welfare. Even Father Miguel from the Catholic Church had come, despite the ongoing denominational tension between his congregation and McKinney's Protestant flock. "Ladies and gentlemen," Martha began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting her way, "we are gathered here today to address a crisis that threatens the very moral foundation of our community. Yesterday, a known killer, a man whose hands are stained with the blood of innocents, walked into our church and abducted my granddaughter's child." "Now, Martha," Mayor Hutchins interrupted gently, "I'm not sure abducted is quite the right word. The boy wasn't exactly in anyone's custody. Martha's eyes flashed dangerously. That child is a Whitmore, regardless of the circumstances of his birth. His mother was my daughter, and that gives me rights that supersede any claim that creature might make. Dr. Pemberton cleared his throat and opened his satchel, removing a thick book bound in brown leather. I've been researching the legal precedents, and I'm afraid the situation is more complicated than it might appear. In cases where a child has been abandoned, and 3 days without proper care could certainly be construed as abandonment, the first person to assume responsibility often has the strongest legal claim. Abandoned. Martha's voice rose to a near shriek. The child was not abandoned. He was in the church under the care of Reverend McKinney, who admits he was unable to properly feed or care for the infant, Father Miguel said quietly. I spoke with Harold this morning. The child was failing, Mrs. Whitmore. Another day or two without proper nutrition, and we might have been planning another funeral. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Martha's face went white, then red, then white again as the implication sank in. Her granddaughter's child, Sarah's baby, had nearly died while she'd been debating the propriety of helping him. That's beside the point, she said finally, her voice shaking. The point is that Ezra Cole is a murderer, a savage. He has no business raising any child, let alone one with Christian blood in his veins. Mayor Hutchins shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Martha, I understand your concerns, but we need to be careful about throwing around accusations. Ezra Cole has never been charged with any crime, let alone convicted of murder. Because he was never caught, Martha snapped. Everyone knows what happened at Broken Creek. Everyone knows what he did to that poor family. Everyone knows the stories, Dr. Pemberton corrected gently. But stories and facts aren't always the same thing. Martha stared at him as if he'd grown a second head. Are you defending him? Are you actually sitting in my parlor and defending a man who slaughtered children? I'm suggesting that we should base our actions on facts rather than rumors, Dr. Pemberton replied calmly. And the fact is that Ezra Cole rescued a dying infant when no one else would step forward. That doesn't sound like the action of a child killer to me. The room fell silent except for the ticking of Martha's grandmother clock and the soft sound of Mrs. Hutchins crying into her handkerchief. Outside, Cedar Falls was going about its normal Sunday business, unaware that the fate of Sarah Whitmore's son was being debated in the finest parlor on Elm Street. There has to be something we can do, Martha said finally, her voice breaking. Some legal action, some way to get that baby away from him before. Before what? Father Miguel asked gently. Before he feeds the child, before he provides shelter and warmth, before he shows the kind of Christian charity that the rest of us failed to demonstrate. Martha turned on the priest with fury in her eyes. How dare you? How dare you suggest that we failed when that man is a killer? Is he? Father Miguel's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath the gentleness. Have you ever spoken to him, Mrs. Whitmore? Have you ever asked him about Broken Creek? Or have you simply accepted the stories because they're easier than confronting the possibility that we might have misjudged a man? I don't need to speak to the devil to know what he is, Martha spat. Then perhaps, Father Miguel said, rising from his chair, you should ask yourself who's really acting like the devil in this situation. The man who saved a dying child, or the people who would rather see that child dead than in the wrong hands. The priest's words hung in the air like gun smoke as he walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back to face the assembled group one more time. I'll be praying for that baby, he said quietly. And I'll be praying for all of you, because I think you're going to need divine guidance to find your way back to what's right. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving the remaining group in stunned silence. Martha's carefully planned coalition was already fracturing, and they hadn't even begun to discuss specific actions. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in his isolated cabin, Ezra was learning that caring for an infant was harder than he'd remembered. Samuel had woken before dawn crying with a hunger that honey water couldn't satisfy, and nothing Ezra tried seemed to help. The baby needed real milk, and he needed it soon. Ezra saddled his horse while Samuel screamed from the makeshift cradle he'd fashioned from a wooden crate and some old blankets. The sound tore at his heart in ways he hadn't expected, bringing back memories of another crying child in another time, when he'd been helpless to stop the suffering. The ride to Mrs. Patterson's farm took 40 minutes, with Samuel wrapped securely in his coat and still crying despite Ezra's attempts to soothe him. Mrs. Patterson's property sat in a valley between two ridges, her small farmhouse surrounded by pastures where a dozen dairy cows grazed peacefully in the morning sun. Ezra knocked on the front door, holding Samuel carefully while the baby continued his unhappy chorus. When Mrs. Patterson opened the door, her eyes widened in shock at the sight of the notorious Ezra Cole standing on her front porch with a crying infant. "Mr. Cole," she stammered, her hand clutching the doorframe. What? Whose baby?" "Sarah Whitmore's son," Ezra said simply. "He needs milk, real milk. I can pay." Mrs. Patterson stared at him for a long moment, her gaze moving from his face to the crying baby and back again. She was a widow herself, her husband killed in a mining accident 3 years earlier, and she'd survived by being practical rather than prejudiced. "How much milk?" she asked finally. "Much as you can spare, and I'll need to come back regular-like until he's old enough for solid food." Mrs. Patterson nodded slowly, then stepped aside to let them into her kitchen. "Bring him here. Let me see what we're dealing with." Inside the warm kitchen, Samuel's crying softened slightly, though he was still obviously distressed. Mrs. Patterson examined the baby with experienced hands, checking his temperature and color. "He's dehydrated," she said bluntly. "Another few hours and you might have lost him. When did he last eat?" 3 days ago, maybe more. Been feeding him honey water since yesterday, but it ain't enough." Mrs. Patterson disappeared into her pantry and returned with a small pot and a clean cloth. Within minutes, she'd warmed fresh milk to the proper temperature and was showing Ezra how to feed the infant properly. "Like this," she instructed, demonstrating how to hold the cloth so Samuel could suck the milk without choking. "Not too fast, or he'll make himself sick." Samuel latched onto the milk-soaked cloth with desperate enthusiasm, his tiny hands grasping at Ezra's fingers while he fed. The change in the baby's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The crying stopped, replaced by the soft sounds of contented feeding. "You done this before," Mrs. Patterson observed, watching Ezra's careful movements. "Long time ago," Ezra replied, the same words he'd used with Reverend McKinney. "Different life." Mrs. Patterson didn't press for details, but she studied Ezra's face while he fed the baby. What she saw there wasn't the cold brutality she'd expected from his reputation, but something else entirely. Pain, maybe. Loss, certainly. And underneath it all, a gentleness that spoke of experience with children. "Town's in an uproar about this," she said after a while. "I expect so. Martha Whitmore's been sending telegrams all morning. Word is she's trying to get the territorial marshal involved." Ezra's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't look up from the feeding baby. "She's got that right, I suppose, being his grandmother and all." "Being his grandmother didn't make her lift a finger when he was crying in that church," Mrs. Patterson pointed out dryly. "Funny how family rights become important when someone else steps up to do the hard work." Samuel finished feeding and immediately fell asleep in Ezra's arms, his tiny face peaceful for the first time since Ezra had met him. Mrs. Patterson watched the transformation with the practiced eye of someone who'd raised 4 children of her own. "He trusts you," she said quietly. "Babies know things, Mr. Cole. They can sense who means them harm and who means them good. That little one wouldn't be sleeping so peaceful in the arms of a child killer." Ezra looked up sharply, meeting her eyes for the first time since entering her kitchen. "You believe the stories about me?" Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if she could read the truth written there. "I believe a man's actions more than I believe other people's words," she said finally. "And your actions yesterday speak louder than any story I've heard." She went to her pantry and returned with 2 large jars of fresh milk. "This should last you a few days. Come back when you need more. And Mr. Cole," she paused, her hand on his arm, "don't let them take him from you. That baby's been through enough already." Ezra nodded once, a sharp movement that conveyed more gratitude than words could have managed. He paid her for the milk and made arrangements to return in 3 days, then headed back toward his cabin with Samuel sleeping peacefully against his chest. But as he rode through the pine forest toward home, Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Martha Whitmore wasn't going to give up easily, and she had resources he lacked. Money, connections, social standing, all the things that could turn the law against him before he'd even had a chance to prove himself as Samuel's guardian. The territorial marshal would come, probably within days. There would be questions about Broken Creek, about his fitness as a guardian, about why a man with his reputation thought he had any right to raise a child. And when those questions came, Ezra would have to decide how much of the truth he was willing to reveal. Because the truth about Broken Creek wasn't what people thought. The truth was worse than murder. It was failure. It was the knowledge that he'd been too late to save the people who'd mattered most to him. It was the guilt of surviving when his own family hadn't, and the rage that had consumed him afterward. But that was a truth for another day. For now, he had Samuel to care for, and that was enough. It had to be enough. The territorial marshal arrived on Tuesday morning like a storm cloud rolling across clear sky. Marshal William Garrett was a tall, lean man with silver hair and eyes like chips of granite, the kind of lawman who'd earned his reputation by being thorough, fair, and absolutely relentless when it came to getting to the truth. He rode into Cedar Falls with 2 deputies and a briefcase full of legal documents, and his first stop was Martha Whitmore's house on Elm Street. Ezra heard about the marshal's arrival from Mrs. Patterson, who'd ridden out to his cabin with fresh milk and news that made his blood run cold. Samuel was thriving under his care. The baby had gained weight, his color was good, and he'd even started making small cooing sounds that might have been attempts at smiling. But none of that would matter if the territorial government decided that Ezra Cole was unfit to raise a child. "He's asking questions about Broken Creek," Mrs. Patterson warned, her voice tight with concern. "Martha's been filling his ear with stories, but I heard tell he's also talking to other folks, people who might have different opinions about what happened out there." Ezra nodded grimly as he fed Samuel, watching the baby's tiny hands grip his finger with trusting strength. "How long before he comes here?" "Day or 2, I'd guess. He's thorough, that one. Won't make a decision without hearing all sides." She paused, studying Ezra's face. "You going to tell him the truth?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Ezra had spent 5 years hiding from the truth about Broken Creek, letting people believe he was a killer because it was easier than explaining what he'd really lost that day. But now, with Samuel's future hanging in the balance, he might not have a choice. "Depends on what he asks," Ezra said finally. "Mr. Cole," Mrs. Patterson said gently, "that baby deserves a guardian who's willing to fight for him. That means fighting with the truth, not with silence." That evening, as Ezra sat in his rocking chair with Samuel sleeping in his arms, he forced himself to remember Broken Creek in full detail for the first time in 5 years. The memories came flooding back like water through a broken dam, carrying with them all the pain and guilt he'd tried so hard to bury. It had been early spring when he'd gotten the letter from his brother-in-law, James Morrison, Sheriff Morrison's cousin, as it turned out, though that connection had only become clear later. James had been trying to establish a homestead at Broken Creek with his wife Anna and their 2 children, but Apache raiders had been hitting isolated farms throughout the territory. He'd asked Ezra to come help with the defense, knowing that Ezra had experience fighting both Indians and outlaws. Ezra had been 3 days too late. He'd arrived at Broken Creek to find the farmhouse burned to the ground, and 4 graves freshly dug behind what had been the barn. James, Anna, and their children, little Sarah who just turned 6, and baby Michael who'd barely learned to walk. All dead, all buried by neighbors who'd found the bodies and done what needed doing before the scavengers could get to them. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the 5th grave, the one marked with a simple wooden cross that read Mary Cole and Thomas Cole, beloved wife and son. Because Ezra's own family had been there when the raiders came. Mary had traveled to Broken Creek with their 3-year-old son to help Anna with the new baby, planning to surprise Ezra when he arrived. Instead, Ezra had found his wife and child buried in unfamiliar ground, killed by men he'd never seen, died while he was still 3 days' ride away believing they were safe at home. The rage that followed had consumed him like wildfire. He tracked the raiding party for 2 weeks, following their trail across 3 territories until he'd found their camp in a canyon near the Mexican border. What happened there wasn't murder. It was justice served with a fury that frightened even Ezra himself. 7 Apache warriors, all dead by his hand, their bodies left for the buzzards and the desert wind. When he'd returned to civilization, the stories had already started. Whispers about Ezra Cole's vengeance, about the man who'd slaughtered an entire Apache war party single-handed. But somehow, in the telling and retelling, the details had gotten twisted. The dead raiders became innocent settlers. The avenging husband became a heartless killer. The truth became a lie that followed him everywhere he went. He'd never bothered to correct the stories. What was the point? His family was still dead. The pain was still there, eating at him from the inside like acid. Let people think what they wanted, at least their fear meant they left him alone with his grief. But now Samuel's soft breathing reminded him that solitude wasn't an option anymore. Now he had someone depending on him, someone who needed him to be more than just a broken man hiding from his past. Marshal Garrett arrived at the cabin Thursday morning, accompanied by 1 deputy and carrying a leather satchel that probably contained enough legal documents to bury Ezra in bureaucratic red tape. Ezra had been expecting them, but he still felt his stomach tighten when he saw the official badges glinting in the morning sunlight. "Mr. Cole," Marshal Garrett said, dismounting from his horse with the careful movements of a man who'd spent too many years in the saddle. "I'm Marshal William Garrett, Territorial Authority. I believe you know why I'm here." "I can guess," Ezra replied, not moving from the porch where he stood holding Samuel. The baby was awake and alert, dark eyes taking in the new arrivals with the curious intensity that infants brought to everything. "Mind if we come inside? I have some questions that need answering." Ezra stepped aside to let them into the cabin, noting how the marshal's eyes swept the interior, taking in the clean surroundings, the books on the shelves, the careful arrangements he'd made for Samuel's care. A wooden cradle sat near the fireplace, handmade and lined with soft blankets. Jars of milk from Mrs. Patterson's farm were arranged neatly on a shelf, along with clean feeding cloths and other baby supplies. "Nice place," Marshal Garrett observed, settling into the chair Ezra offered. "Not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Based on some of the reports I've received, something more like a wolf's den." The marshal's eyes found Samuel, who was making soft gurgling sounds in Ezra's arms. "That the Whitmore baby?" "Samuel Cooper Cole," Ezra corrected firmly. "And yes, he was Sarah Whitmore's son." "You've given him your name." "He needed one. His mother didn't have time to choose before she died." Marshal Garrett nodded and pulled a notebook from his pocket, along with a pencil that looked like it had seen hard use. "Mr. Cole, I need to ask you some direct questions and I need direct answers. Can you do that for me?" "Depends on the questions." "Fair enough. The marshal flipped through several pages of notes. Let's start with the easy one. How did you come to be caring for this child? Ezra told the story simply and without embellishment. The crying in the church, the 3 days of neglect, the confrontation with Martha Whitmore and the others. Marshal Garrett listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes but mostly just watching Ezra's face as he spoke. And Mrs. Whitmore's claim that you have no legal right to the child. She's probably correct, legally speaking. But legally speaking, nobody else wanted him either, not until I stepped in. That brings us to the harder questions, Marshal Garrett said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. Mrs. Whitmore has made some serious allegations about your character, Mr. Cole. She claims you're a danger to children based on events that supposedly occurred at a place called Broken Creek. Samuel chose that moment to start fussing, his tiny face scrunching up in preparation for crying. Ezra automatically began the gentle rocking motion that seemed to calm the baby, his attention split between the marshal's questions and Samuel's needs. What exactly did Mrs. Whitmore tell you about Broken Creek? Ezra asked carefully. She claims you murdered an entire family, man, woman, and 2 children. Claims you went mad and killed them in cold blood. Marshal Garrett's eyes were steady, professional. She seems to believe that makes you unfit to care for any child, regardless of the circumstances. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, still rocking Samuel until the baby settled back into peaceful alertness. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. Marshal, what if I told you that Mrs. Whitmore was wrong about what happened at Broken Creek? Not lying, necessarily, but wrong about the facts. I'd say that's exactly what I came here to find out. Ezra looked down at Samuel, studying the tiny face that had already become so important to him. The baby was watching him with those serious dark eyes, as if he could sense the weight of the moment. The family that died at Broken Creek, Ezra said finally, their name was Morrison, James and Anna Morrison, and their children Sarah and Michael. He paused, gathering his courage. James Morrison was my brother-in-law. Anna was my wife's sister. Marshal Garrett's pencil stopped moving across the page. Your wife's sister. My wife Mary and our son Thomas were visiting them when the Apache raiders came. All 6 of them died together, the Morrisons and my family. Ezra's voice broke slightly on the last words. I found them when I arrived 3 days too late to save any of them. The silence that followed was profound. Even Samuel seemed to sense the gravity of the revelation, remaining perfectly still in Ezra's arms while the truth settled over the cabin like morning mist. So you didn't kill the Morrison family, Marshal Garrett said slowly. No, sir, I buried them, all 6 of them, in graves I dug with my own hands. Ezra met the marshal's eyes directly. But I did kill the Apache raiders who murdered them, tracked them for 2 weeks and killed every last one of them. 7 men, all dead by my hand. And that's how the stories got started. Stories have a way of changing in the telling. Dead raiders became dead settlers. An avenging husband became a heartless killer. Ezra shrugged, the movement careful so as not to disturb Samuel. Easier to let people believe what they wanted than to keep explaining that my wife and child were dead. Marshal Garrett made several notes, his expression thoughtful. Mr. Cole, why didn't you ever correct these stories? Why let people believe you were a murderer? Because the truth hurt too much to keep telling it. Because staying quiet meant people left me alone with my grief. Ezra looked down at Samuel again. Because I didn't think it mattered what anyone believed about me. And now I have someone depending on me who doesn't deserve to suffer for my reputation. Marshal Garrett closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair, studying Ezra with new understanding. Mr. Cole, I'm going to need to verify your account of events at Broken Creek. That means talking to people who were there, checking burial records, maybe even visiting the site itself. Do what you need to do. In the meantime, I want you to know that based on what I've seen here today, the condition of this child, the obvious care you're providing, the environment you've created, I see no immediate reason to remove him from your custody." Relief flooded through Ezra so powerfully that he nearly staggered. Samuel made a soft cooing sound, as if he could sense the change in tension. "However," Marshal Garrett continued, "Mrs. Whitmore has filed formal papers claiming custody as the child's grandmother. Even if your account of Broken Creek is verified, there will still be legal proceedings to determine permanent custody." "How long?" "Could be weeks, could be months. Territorial courts move slowly, and cases involving child custody tend to be particularly complex." The marshal stood and retrieved his hat. "My advice: get yourself a lawyer, Mr. Cole, a good one, because regardless of what really happened at Broken Creek, you're going to need legal help to keep this child." As the marshal and his deputy prepared to leave, Samuel began fussing again, making the small, hungry sounds that meant feeding time was approaching. Ezra automatically reached for one of the milk-soaked cloths, his movements practiced and confident after just a few days of caring for the baby. Marshal Garrett paused in the doorway, watching Ezra feed Samuel with gentle patience. "Mr. Cole, for what it's worth, I think that baby's lucky to have found you." After they left, Ezra sat in his rocking chair with Samuel sleeping peacefully in his arms, trying to process everything that had just happened. The truth about Broken Creek was out now, at least partially. The marshal seemed inclined to believe him, which was more than Ezra had dared hope for. But Martha Whitmore wasn't going to give up easily, and she had legal standing as Samuel's grandmother. The fight was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, their dark shadows racing across the valley like harbingers of trouble to come. But inside the cabin, Samuel slept peacefully in the arms of the man who'd claimed him, unaware that his future hung in the balance of a legal battle that would test everything Ezra thought he knew about justice, family, and redemption. 6 weeks later, the custody hearing arrived. Martha brought a lawyer from Denver who painted her as the grieving grandmother. Ezra's lawyer focused on the truth. For 3 days, everyone had walked past a crying baby until one man stepped forward. Mrs. Patterson testified that Samuel had been dying when Ezra found him. Marshal Garrett confirmed Ezra had never murdered settlers but lost his own family at Broken Creek. Martha's testimony crumbled under cross-examination. She admitted making no effort to help Samuel during those crucial days. When Ezra testified, his words were simple. "I took him because he needed someone. Asked what he'd provide, he answered, 'Love, most of all love.'" The final test came when Judge Morrison observed Samuel with both guardians. In Martha's arms, the baby cried desperately. The moment Ezra held him, Samuel stopped crying and relaxed completely. Judge Morrison's decision was swift. Custody is awarded to Ezra Cole. This child is now legally your son. That evening, Ezra sat rocking Samuel in their cabin. "Well, son, looks like it's you and me." Samuel cooed softly, and the evening wind carried their contentment across the valley like a prayer answered.